I watched John Adams this weekend, the outstanding 2008 HBO seven-part docudrama starring Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney as the titular Mr. and Mrs. Adams, respectively. I think it's only the second time I've watched it all the way through, so I was glad I happened to think of it this weekend because it really is a good bit of Independence Day viewing. If I have any complaints, they're probably with the casting, and not because any of the actors did a bad job, quite the opposite. They all gave wonderful performances, but for my part, I do find it just a bit jarring when the founding fathers of the United States are being portrayed and Paul Giamatti is the only American guy in the room. I mean, Tom Wilkinson, one of my favorite actors, I'll watch anything he's in, but Tom Wilkinson as Benjamin Franklin, you couldn't cast an American actor to play the most quintessentially American personality in the history of Americanity. So I'm watching the scenes that depict the Second Continental Congress, and I'm looking at all the fine English actors who were present playing our American founders, and I'm thinking, guys, it's like a Game of Thrones reunion in here. And then I remembered that they were making this thing in 2007 when Game of Thrones was just starting to become a massively huge worldwide cultural phenomenon. So it was thus right around that time when there seemed to be a federal law that every new TV or film production had to have somebody from Game of Thrones in it. Well, I have no complaints about Giamatti in the title role, as some critics, I guess, did. Those who complained that his portrayal wasn't likable enough probably don't know a whole lot about John Adams, and thus probably fail to grasp the irony of their assertion, since Adams himself would be the first to admit that unlikability was probably his central defining character trait. But the HBO series gets one thing wrong about John Adams that seemingly everybody gets wrong, all the way up to biographers and professional historians. When it takes a few moments early in the third episode to mock him, right along with the first group of senators, for his supposed affection for monarchism and ostentatious titles of nobility. Now, the idea of John Adams being a closet monarchist has held sway among the mainstream of historians for centuries now. It is mentioned, just as in the HBO series, only long enough to crack a couple of jokes at the expense of good old monarchist John. But I would submit, as I have submitted before on this very program, that to impute pro-monarchy sentiments onto John Adams, and thus imply that he was somehow less committed to the cause of democracy and self-government than were his contemporaries, is frankly a scurrilous attack on the character and the patriotism of a man whose character and patriotism were never remotely in doubt. Regarding titles of nobility, Adams felt it was a mistake to dismiss them out of hand, insofar as the framers of the Constitution chose to include in Article 2 the clause saying that no such titles are ever to be conferred under the auspices of the United States. And this is the point where most people just chuckle at monarchist John and move on to something else. But his rationale for why the country should retain the option of granting noble titles seemingly never gets a fair hearing from anyone. But Mr. Adams, I have got your back. Today you get your fair hearing. So first, when we're talking about the framing of the Constitution, we have to remember, as a lot of people do not, that Adams and Jefferson played no part in those proceedings. Adams was in London at the time, and Jefferson was in Paris, and we know of their thoughts pertaining to the Constitutional Convention primarily from their letters to one another. Now, whispers would reach Europe every so often about what was going on in the convention, and if Jefferson heard something first, then he would immediately fire off a letter sharing it with Adams, and vice versa, and thus, since it was the 18th century, much of their information was incomplete, some of it rather laughably incorrect, but it matters not, because history has furnished us with a detailed record of the two main authors of American independence giving more or less a real-time dialogue a dozen years later on the coming together of the Constitution, which hopefully would prove itself equal to the task of enshrining and upholding the principles that animated the claiming of that independence in the first place. It was Adams in London who first received the word, or the rumor, such as it was, that the new Constitution would contain a blanket prohibition on all titles of nobility. Not only would no such titles be granted by the United States or any of its constituent governments, But persons holding foreign titles of nobility, in order to hold any office or public trust under the United States, must relinquish and renounce said titles first. The second part Adams didn't have any problem with. If you're going to come to the United States and hold public office, you don't need to be waving some fancy European noble title in anybody's face. But he felt at the same time it was a serious mistake for the country to deprive itself of the option in its founding charter to even contemplate the granting of such titles if and when there was ever seen to be a use for them. And why might there be such use one day? Because, or so Adams felt, we ought to retain for ourselves the option of emulating what he, Adams, thought was the best safeguard of democracy that exists in the English parliamentary system, and that is the fact that all real political power, legislative and executive alike, in England is vested in the House of Commons, and people with noble titles may not sit in the House of Commons. Members of the nobility and the aristocracy may only sit in the House of Lords, whose ability to wield real political power even back then in the 18th century was only notional at best. Now, John Adams was as much a lover of democracy as any man in that room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. His belief in the potential utility of a titled noble class was not so that such a class could be empowered unto itself, but rather so that it could be walled off from power, so that no mistake could be made on this point. If you want to wield political power, if you want to stand for office, and you're from the aristocratic class, then tough shit. Renounce your lands and your titles, and then maybe we'll talk. And doesn't it sound nice that we should be able to do that? And especially today. Because now we, for all intents and purposes, have a nobility and an aristocracy in all but name, where we venerate dull bureaucrats and fake scientists, and afford them all the reverence that dukes and earls and viscounts get in other countries. The crucial difference being, those dukes and earls and viscounts are walled off, excluded entirely from wielding the levers of state power, which I would submit is an altogether good and proper thing. And I would furthermore submit that lots of people owe John Adams an apology for not properly considering the actual point that he was trying to make. And with that, Jim Eagle's going to hit the music. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we still say welcome ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, instead of welcome you indistinct androgynous lumps of humanity, because we're just not as cool as Disneyland and we never will be. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And congratulations to you, America, because I heard it was your 245th birthday yesterday, you old girl. And if I may say so, ma'am, you don't look a day over 217, 218. In fact, if I saw you and Canada standing next to each other, I would never even guess she was 90 years younger. Now, you've heard me talk before on this program, more than once, more than twice, probably more than a dozen times, about the fact that we have largely lost our common culture as Americans, where once there were always areas of common assent, things we could agree on as a common starting point when discussing our political differences, but one by one, we've seen all of those things stripped away. Now, yesterday, in the mainstream fake news media on July 4th, they seemed determined to finish the job of turning the American flag into a banner of hate that only scary people called white supremacists wave from scary vehicles called pickup trucks. So, if you see anyone fitting that description, please don't hesitate to call the FBI's hate crime tip line, and if you also find a piece of string on a garage door, we'll throw in a 12-agent rapid response team and a special bonus gift, free of charge. Now, we are told with great fervor and with great regularity by the people who declare themselves to be our moral superiors that the symbols of our country are, each and every one of them, symbols of racism. That the men who founded and built our republic are, each and every one of them, practitioners and defenders of racism. That the national institutions they built, each and every one of them, are monuments to racism. That the moral stains of our founding are so malevolent, so indelible, so monstrously evil in character, that no amount of good can ever ameliorate or assuage them. I want to put that theory to the test tonight. For people who view the entirety of United States history as merely a series of zero-sum value judgments, where one thing is 100% good and noble and virtuous, and the other thing is 100% bad and evil and mean, and the study of history is simply an exercise of placing people and things into the good box or the evil box. But I'm going to relate the story of an event that stubbornly resists the assignment of such flippant labels and such arbitrary moral judgments. And it is the story of Operation Babylift. Culturally, it's seemingly been a settled question for some decades now that the Vietnam War was a bad war, that we shouldn't have fought it, that we had nothing to gain from getting involved in the first place, and that we did gain nothing from it in the event, aside from 58,000 dead young men and a rather large stain on our national and military prestige. The last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam on 29 March 1973 per the terms of the Paris Treaty. And for most of the people in the country, our country I mean, who'd been listening to Vietnam news every day for the better part of the last decade, they were all too happy to mentally check out and consider the war at an end for our purposes. But we still had tens of thousands of personnel over there. We had military advisors trying to stand the South Vietnamese army on its own 2 feet, getting them outfitted with new equipment, showing them how to use it, trying to make them into an effective fighting force that could hopefully beat back the invasion that everybody knew was coming. We had all manner of diplomatic and bureaucratic types doing the same job on the civilian side that the advisors were doing on the military side, trying to fashion South Vietnam into a functioning state with functioning institutions, lest they be overrun by the NVA and the whole of Southeast Asia fall under the yoke of communist tyranny. But by March of 1975, it was becoming all too clear that our best efforts were going to be insufficient, that the South Vietnamese were in the process of being overrun, and there wasn't much left to do except get our people the hell out of there while we still could. But if only it were that simple. Because we've also got 3,500 babies and toddlers who are in our care. Some of them are the offspring of U.S. soldiers and Vietnamese girlfriends. Some are orphans with no family left alive, and there are some about whom nothing is known at all. Babies that were left on hospital doorsteps, things like that, and thus entered into the care of the U.S. government. By the first week of April, the NVA artillery shells were starting to fall inside the Saigon city limits, and the need to effect the evacuation of U.S. personnel went from acute to pressing, as did the need to decide on the disposition of the 3,500 orphans. Now, we are often told these days, more than we've ever been told before, that our country is founded and animated by principles of racism and white supremacy, that each decision undertaken by the U.S. government is undertaken to advance the twin causes of racism and white supremacy. And if this were true, there would have been no difficult decision to make about those 3,500 Vietnamese orphans. An evil racist country would simply leave those children behind, abandon them to their fate, and never give it a second thought. But what did our country do? We adopted every single last one of them. We began loading them on airplanes before we even had a firm plan of what we were going to do with them. Public appeals were immediately issued in the newspapers, on TV, on the radio, saying, we've got all these babies on the way and we need people to adopt them, or at least take care of them, while we arrange for them to be adopted. Now, the duty of actually transporting the children fell to the Military Airlift Command. The original plan was to use exclusively C-141 Starlifters, but when a C-5 Galaxy happened to be passing through Saigon, bringing field guns for the South Vietnamese army, it was decided that rather than send the world's biggest cargo plane back home empty with nothing on it, let's use it for the first flight of Operation Babylift, as it was by then being called. And then the White House started getting involved, and they saw a chance for a great PR photo op, so President Ford flew out to San Diego so he could personally meet the C-5 and the first plane load of babies when it touched down on U.S. soil. But the C-5 had only just recently entered service, and as with any new aircraft, it was notorious for certain maintenance issues. Worse yet, the C-5 that was being used for the first Babylift flight had been repurposed from a different assignment, so the ground crew that got it ready to fly on 4 April 1975 was not its regular ground crew. Moreover, they were on heavy deadline to get the plane airborne because nobody wanted the president standing around waiting in San Diego. And so, C-5A, Galaxy tail number 68-0218, starts its takeoff roll just after 1600 hours, with 314 souls on board, 11 flight crew, 35 employees of the Defense Attaché Office, who were the people who were tasked with looking after the children while they were en route, and 268 orphans. 12 minutes after takeoff at an altitude of 23,000 feet, the rear cabin door explosively ruptured, causing a cabin depressurization. Debris from the door severed the control cables in the tail, causing the loss of half of the airplane's hydraulic systems. The pilot, Captain Bud Traynor, co-pilot Captain Tilford Harp, had lost all of their flight controls except spoilers, throttles, and one aileron, but they managed to get the thing turned around so they could attempt to return to the runway from which they had departed. But despite all of the skill and heroism that they could muster, they wound up short of the runway in a rice paddy. The airplane broke into 4 pieces and 138 people perished, including 78 of the orphans. The cause of the crash was attributed to improper maintenance. Now, back in the United States, the crash of the C-5 and the deaths of 78 orphans brought the Vietnam War suddenly back to the forefront of the American public consciousness. And there was another effect that it had too. That effect was that every single one of those Vietnamese orphans had new American parents before their plane even hit the runway. And some of the prospective new parents, if they couldn't figure out where they were supposed to go to fill out the paperwork, they just went down to the airport and stood on the tarmac. And demographically speaking, what kind of people were these who dropped everything else in their lives to adopt a child from the other side of the world just because they heard there were children who needed a mommy and a daddy? Well, they were primarily, almost exclusively, white Southern Christians. But wait, that can't be right. On CNN, they're always telling me white Southern Christians are the lowest form of life in the universe. A bigoted, racist rabble who secretly wish a return to Jim Crow segregation, if not slavery itself. But it is right. It's exactly right. And you know why? Because the American people are a fundamentally good, decent, honest people. They are a people of charity, of empathy, and of altruism. The American character is defined not by made-up nonsense terms like systemic racism and social equity, but by decent, good-hearted people acting in decent, good-hearted ways. A country that is evil and racist in character, that is populated by evil, racist people, is incapable of an act of such fundamental goodness and decency as Operation Babylift. And anyone who wishes to debate the point, I would invite them to name a time and a place of their choosing. See you Wednesday. Get off my lawn.